Rabotai, we are continuing on Masechet Berachot, and we are on Daf Yud Tet Amud Aleph, 20 lines from the bottom, and the Amud Yomi is learning for the month of Av is sponsored by Mrs. Navid Bayanvar for the Refuah Shlema of Shefa Bat Nechama, and for health and happiness of their children, Rafael Miriam Bat Zipporah, Chana Bat Zipporah, Muna Rachel Bat Zipporah, and Sophia Sarah Bat Zipporah should have much nachat from them. Amen. Now, we are in the middle of the discussion of 24 things that the Beit Din would actually enact a nidui, an excommunication, for someone that disrespects the Torah, disrespects the Chachamim. That's what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, and his student went to find on a journey through the Mishnayot to try to find where are these 24 places, and he only found 3. And we mentioned the 3, and now the Gemara is amidst challenging those 3. Maybe we find more, and each one of them has had their own answer. The last one that we attempted was the Mishnah in Masechet Baba Metzia. The Gemara is brought there. The Mishnah is in Idiot, and the Machloket is between Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus, aka Rabbi Eliezer Agadol, and Rabbi Yehoshua, and the rest of the Beit Midrash on what we call Tanur Shel Achnai, that the Tanur, the oven that was made out of earthware, and it became tameh, whether or not you have an etzah to make it tahor by slicing it to rings and then reconstructing it by cementing those rings together back up as a tanur. Rabbi Eliezer Agadol said, of course you can, because once you slice it to rings, it becomes tahor, and once it becomes tahor, it no longer becomes tameh. Rabbi Yehoshua disagreed. He said, no, you cannot do that. Rabban Gamliel and the rest of the Beit Midrash agreed with Rabbi Yehoshua, and it became one of the most fascinating stories of all time, basically, of Rabbi Eliezer trying to prove himself right with all the ra'ayot she'ba'olam, says the Gemara, and they did not accept his proofs until he basically started miraculous proofs for himself that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should do this miracle and that miracle and the other miracle if he's right, and all of which happened, and they were unimpressed until he said, the bat kol yochiach, that a heavenly voice, no less than a heavenly voice should come out and say that he is right, which happened. The bat kol said, Hanichul Eliezer beni sha'aracha kemoto, leave my son Eliezer alone, the halacha is like him. And Rabbi Yehoshua got up and said, Hashem, you have given us the Torah, you have written in that Torah, lo b'shamayim, he is not in the heavens. You want the Sanhedrin, the body of the Sanhedrin or Chachamim of the generation to be dealing with that, which is a fascinating talk by itself. Why we have Torah Sheba'al Peh and Torah Shebechtav, both of them, the only, so to speak, way that the person could guarantee a Mesorah to be intact is if you have a body of written law and also oral, because you have, the written law means whatever you want it to mean. It's the whole thing of Bible critics. You could try to prove a different religion from the Torah, because this, I never forget when the Reform wanted to support same-sex marriages and so on. They said it's provable from the Torah itself, even though that the Torah also says Mot Yum Shenehem Demeim Bam, that this is a horrific thing, and it will become actually one of those mitzvahs. The Torah speaks about it deliberately, black and white. But they said, well, the Torah says Ve'ahavta l'ra'acha kamocha. That very famous passage is actually speaking the ra'acha, is talking about same sex, and therefore they wanted to bring a proof from the Torah itself to allow something that's explicitly mentioned in the Torah, not like that. So therefore you need a oral body of the laws as well. So Rabbi Yehoshua said basically you cannot interfere, and they put Rabbi Eliezer into cherem, into excommunication, because he did not want to accept. At the end of the day, they were the majority. He had to accept it. He should have, and he did not, and he was put into cherem. So you see from here that disrespect to the body of the Torah, the majority of Chachamim actually gives an isur, and you put him in cherem. So this is the fourth place in the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, no. And by the way, this is Tanur Shel Achnai. Achnai is the snake, because they surrounded Rabbi Eliezer with all of their proofs against him, like a snake that surrounds something all around it. And that is the reason that's called Tanur Shel Achnai, says the Gemara. V'zeu Tanur Shel Achnai. My Achnai, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Melamed she'ikifu halachot ka'achnai zeh. They surrounded Rabbi Eliezer with all halachot from all over, like a snake that surrounds its prey, and they proved that it should be tameh. V'tanya oto hayom. That day, when they reached a maskara, when they reached a conclusion, Heviu kol ta'arot shetir Rabbi Eliezer, everyone that had relied on Rabbi Eliezer to allow taharot, pure items, things that were tahor, and they had made, let's say, a challah in that tanur that was truma or anything that was supposed to be tahor, they brought all of them and they burnt it in front of him. They burnt it in front of him. At the end, he did not agree to reverse himself and to retract, and therefore they put him in cherem.
What's cherem?
Excommunication, right? They excommunicated him. Actually, you see elsewhere in the Gemara in Sanhedrin that he actually died in excommunication. That's the famous story of the last days of his life, and all of his students, they got together. Rabbi Akiva was one of them. And he actually expressed a high level of displease for the fact that all these years, he said, I am like a Sefer Torah that was closed, never opened. You guys, my students, you did not learn enough from me. And now this Sefer Torah is being closed forever. And that opportunity that you had is basically going to be lost forever, because Eliezer never forgot a thing. He had literally a photographic memory, and he felt that it was like a stronghold of Torah that was never used in the way that it was supposed to be properly used. That's a story for itself for a different time. It says,
stone on top of this casket.
Perhaps they did. Yes. Says the Gemara, V'tanya, Oto Hayom, they brought this, they put him in cherem, and that's a question supposedly on the fact that we found only 3. This is going to be the 4th one, and this was mentioned in the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, Afilu hachi nidui b'matnitin lo tinam. It's true that the machloket around the tanur shel achnai of this oven that became impure, and you slice it to rings, that machloket, that debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua is mentioned in the Mishnah in the Yod. But the story is not mentioned. The story of how they debated and the heavenly voice, and then him not accepting, and them putting him in cherem, in excommunication, that's not mentioned. When Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said there are cases in the Mishnah, that means that the Mishnah would talk about a person being put in excommunication. And that's not mentioned in the Mishnah. That rather is mentioned in the Gemara. Says the Gemara. The actual nidui part of it was not said in the Mishnah. And says the Gemara, so how in the world do you find 24 places? Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said 24 places, and Rabbi Lazar could not find more than 3. How do you have such a discrepancy from 24 to 3? Says the Gemara, that's a good question. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi medameh milta lemilta, but Rabbi Lazar lo medameh milta lemilta. You're correct, says the Gemara. Really, explicitly mentioned is not more than 3. And that's why Rabbi Elazar could not find more than 3 of them, because there aren't more cases than 3 that are explicitly mentioned in the Mishnah the way we brought them in our Gemara. So how did he get to 24? Says the Gemara, the way he got to 24 is Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi compared cases together. Says, now that we have these 3, this case in the Mishnah is like this one is like this one is like this one, and the other one is like the other one. And that's how he got to 24. Rabbi Elazar only was thinking of actual cases, and actual cases you do not have more than 3 of them, and therefore he only came up with 3. So says the Gemara by 2 dots now. Back to our main topic, main sugya, nos'eh hamita v'chilufehen. We mentioned the people who are carrying the coffin and the people who are backups to them, they are patur. And then we explain if they are needed, if they're not needed, and so on. Let's actually spend some time discussing this. Tan Rabbanan. We learned in the Braita, Ein motziin et hamet samuch lekriyat Shema. Guess what? If you have a proceeding of funeral and it's 5 minutes before time for Shema, don't start. Wait 5 minutes. Let everybody say Shema. Why would you do something that's going to take you away from the mitzvah d'oraita of saying Shema? Don't do that. Wait 5 minutes, say Shema, then start the proceeding of the funeral. You don't start taking the deceased, the coffin of the deceased out, samuch lekriyat Shema, if it's mamash right before the time for saying Shema. But if you by mistake started, you didn't think about this and it already started, then you don't stop it, because it's not respectful for the met, for the kavod of the deceased, for you to stop the proceeding. Says the Gemara, Eni, is that correct? Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef, the famous Rav Yosef, right? Rabbi Rav Yosef, when he passed away and they took his coffin out, it was mamash right before Shema, and yet they did it. So you're telling me that you don't take the Aron out if it's right before Shema, but by Rabbi Yosef's funeral, he was the Rosh Hashiva, they did it for him. Says the Gemara, Adam Chashuv Shani, a respectful person like Rabbi Yosef, he was the Rosh Hashiva, he was the greatest, one of the greatest Talmidei Chachamim of his time. That is very different, because for the kavod of the Torah, you don't wait even 1 moment. Every minute that you delay and the dead corpse is sitting there, it's not respectful. Now, of course, to stop a proceeding is very disrespectful. So even for a regular person, if you have already started, you don't stop. But for Rabbi Yosef, you don't even wait. You start it immediately right away. Fine. So we learned the Mishnah, when they're bringing within the proceeding of the funeral, the people who are bringing the body, the Aron, on their shoulders. So we mentioned that people who they are needed, they're going to be needed immediately afterwards. They are patur from Shema. The ones who are not needed, they could say Shema, they should say Shema. Taraman. We learned in the Bright. Haoskim behesped, people who are in amidst eulogy. Right? That means they already buried the body and now they're eulogizing. Or they have not buried the body, right prior to the burial, they're saying eulogy. Bizman shamet mutalif nehem, when the dead body is right in front of them, nishmatin echad bekorin. Each one of them, one by one, they sneak out, so to speak, of the immediate surrounding of the coffin of the dead body, and they say Shema, because you can't say Shema in front of it, it's not respectful, is the concept that we discussed before, lo egel arash. It's as if you're mocking the deceased that can no longer do mitzvot, can no longer do kriyat Shema and accomplish anything in this world, and therefore you go out of respect, you say it and you come back. But if they are eulogizing after the burial, or it's in a different room, right? The dead body is in a different room, and people are surrounding the Avelim, the family of the deceased, and they're eulogizing, but not in front of the coffin. Then you stop the eulogy. Everyone says Shema, and there's no problem with that. Hen yoshvin vekorin, they would sit and say Shema, behu yoshev bedomem. And the Avel, Rachmana litzlan, the person who is a close family of the deceased, he sits and he's quiet. Hen omdim umitpaledim, and it comes time for tefillah, they all stand up and they even daven Shemona Esrei. You remember before we mentioned that Shema is more important than Shemona Esrei because perhaps Shema is Deoraita. Shemona Esrei, we mentioned, Rambam holds once a day is biblical. Ramban says every single Shemona Esrei that we daven is the Rabbanan, is not Deoraita unless we are in distress and the community is in distress and Shat Sarah, then if, according to everybody is Deoraita. Again, we're going to be coming back to those details when we start the Perek Tefillat HaShachar. We're going to discuss those details. But says the Gemara, they would stand and daven even though that they're like literally in front of the Avel and they're in the middle of the eulogy before the burial. They stop the whole process to say Shema and Tefillah, and the Avel does whatever he has to do. By Shema, he stays quiet, and by Tefillah, the Gemara says something very controversial. It says the Gemara, he stands up and instead of davening, he says a special format of Siduk Hadin. So now, Avelim, nowadays also, halachically, every day they say Siduk Hadin. Siduk Hadin is basically to announce HaKadosh Baruch Hu as righteous. We understand that we don't understand. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a very complex system of judicial system of who dies and why they do, at the age that they do and the way they do, and so on. So we have like a very simple passage of Tziduk Adin. And Avel Rachmana litzlan, by the funeral also, halachically speaking, was supposed to be done at the time of Yetziat Neshama, the time that the Neshama leaves the body. The whoever is there tears their clothing, and the family supposed to say the bracha Dayan Ha'emet. And that's called Siduk Adin. I say, Hashem, you are the true judge. You know what you're doing. We don't necessarily always understand. But nevertheless, this Siduk Adin that the Gemara is saying here is a very interesting one. And it's going to become, in just a moment, a matter of massive controversy. What does he say, says the Gemara? Here's what he says. Ve'omer, and he says, Ribon ha'olamim, 9 lines up. Harbe chatati lefarecha. I have sinned so much in front of you, Hashem. I've deviated from your will so many times in so many different ways. V'lo nifrata mimeni. And you never cashed in. You never punished me. Echad mini elef. Even 1,000th of what punishment I should go through, you haven't done, Hashem. Yehi ratzon milefanecha, should be will from in front of you, Hashem. Hashem Elokeinu, shetigdor pirsotenu, that you should fix our breaches. Upirsot kol amecha bet Yisrael, and not only our problems, but the problems of all of the people. Berachamim, with your compassion, Hashem. And that's the Siduk Hadin that he says. Amar Abaya, this is, remember Rabotai, this is a Braita, right? This is a Tanaic piece of commentary, right? Which brings a big problem with the next few words of the Gemara. Amar Abaya, who is an Amora, and not just the Amora, but a late Amora. Amar Abaya, no mi a person should not say that. Why not? Why shouldn't you say that? Because of a concept of Leolam al yiftach adam piv lesatan. You should not mention something that has a negative connotation because you never know it may actually happen, right? But the question is, well, how in the world can Abaye, who's a late Amorah, disagree with a Tanaic piece of work? We know that Tanaim could argue with each other, but an Amora cannot take on a Tana. It's different levels of greatness, and they're just not in the league to take on a Tana. So the answer that some of the Mefarshim tried to give is because what Abaye quotes here right now actually has a Tanaic support from Rabbi Yossi, as well, as you're going to see in just a moment. So says Abaye, you should not speak like that because Amar Rab Shimon ben Levi. V'chen Tana Mishmed Rabbi Yossi. We learned in the name, the Braita, in the name of Rabbi Yossi, Le'olam aliftach Adam piv leSatan. A person should never open his mouth for Satan. What does it mean, opening your mouth for Satan? What does that mean? That means do not mention that something negative should happen to you. Because if you say it, the words have a power that they actually may happen. Example, the Gemara gives itself. V'amar Rabbi Yosef, my Kara, how do you know? How do you learn this concept that you shouldn't say negative things? I would say speech is air. Just say whatever you want to say. It's, Dibur lav ki ma'aseh dami, right? So says the Gemara. We learn it from a pasuk. Shenemar. Actually, this is very interesting because this is a haftarah of Yeshaya in the 3 weeks, the haftarah of Shabbat Chazon. Says the Gemara, Kim'at kistom hayinu v'cha'amora daminu. Says we have become like Sodom and Gomorrah. We have become like Sodom and Amorah. We have become like Reshaim, negative people, like the people, the residents of Sodom and Gomorrah. Says the Gemara, and immediately afterwards, Hashem actually calls them Sodom and Amorah. They said, well, we are almost like as bad as Sodom and Amorah. And immediately afterwards, my Achtar Lehu Navi, what does the Navi answer them? Shimu dvar Hashem ksine Sodom. Hashem calls them actually ksine Sodom. Says the sharp, piercing words of the Navi Yeshaya that calls them all kinds of names. In this week's haftarah, Shimu dvar Hashem ksine Sodom. Hazinu Torah Elokenu am Amorah. Calls them Sodom and Amorah. So says the Gemara, the generals, the heads, the important people, right? So says the Gemara. By the way, you see this in the Gemara in Chagigah. The Gemara says the Gemara is talking about a person's decree to pass away, and can a person pass away not exactly on their time that was decreed, which is a fascinating hashkafic question throughout Shas. You see it in Masechet Chagigah on page 4. You see it in the 9th chapter of Masechet Baba Batra. Can a person's free will trump someone else's destiny? Can I decide to kill someone that's not their time yet? Or myself, can a person decide to jump off and end their life even though it's not time for them? That's a fascinating talk, not necessarily, but the Gemara says an example in Daf Dalet Amud Bet in Masechet Chagigah about a person that her name was Miriam. And Malach HaMavet was tasked by going and taking her on a ride. And he comes and he takes the wrong Miriam. Right? He was supposed to go and take Miriam Megadla Sar Neshaya, I believe. And he went and actually took some, and of course, what happened? Because this Miriam that was not supposed to die at that moment did something and said something that ruined her mazal, and now that the mazal completely was vulnerable, it was a moment of tremendous vulnerability, and she was able to be snatched away. Now, of course, this is super complicated. It's not just like that. You said something, you did something, but it could be a moment. It could be a moment that a person says something, and those words are sealed and signed, and therefore, be always careful. You should never open your mouth in a negative way like that, right? By the way, just the extra credit, the Tosafot over there in Masechet Chagigah, say, you know who the other person was actually a very famous figure in the history that was like equivalent to the mother of Hitler, so to speak, and you wonder that maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu actually wanted that person to stay, even though that was their time to go. because they had a shlichut, they had something that had to come through them, even though be it a negativity, but nevertheless, there's something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to happen in this world. Sometimes Hashem keeps someone against all odds because they have an agency to do in this world. Now, we hope that our agencies are always positive, but you never know. So says the Gemara. By two dots, 5 months up at the end, when they already buried the fellow, the deceased, and came back, now starts the process of comforting the Breff family and trying to be there for them. And the way we mentioned before was the Avelim would be in the center, and there would be rows of people around them, the outer circles and the inner circles, trying to reach them, comfort them, wish them their condolences properly, and leave. That's the way they used to do it. Nowadays, there's a shura that people stand on two sides and they pass through and people talk to them and so on. Back in the day, it was more kavua. The Avel would be sitting in the middle, and people would round up around them, circles after circles, different layers, until they would wish their condolences, they would talk, they would get out, and then the circles, the outer circles, little by little would come in, and that's how they did it. So says the Gemara, Im yacholim la'atchil v'ligmor et kula in aval perek echad or pasuk echad lo. We mentioned in the Mishnah that if they could start and finish, then they should do it. If they can't, then they should not. So the Gemara assumes that when he says they could start and finish, it means start and finish the entire Shema. The entire Shema, which would indicate that if you have enough time, let's say Shema takes 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes for you. If you have 5 minutes, you're mamash at the very end until you get into the inner, where you could see the inner circle as we're going to discuss. You have 5 minutes, so then finish it. But if you don't have 5 minutes, if you don't have 4 minutes, whatever it takes you to say Shema, then don't start it even. That's what seems to indicate. The Gemara says, well, a Braita says, I have a Braita that says clearly not like that. Says the Gemara, or minhu, it's questionable what you assume. Because kavru et hamet v'chazru, it says when the Braita says clearly, when you buried the deceased and you came back, im yecholin la'atchil v'ligmor afilu perek echad o pasuk echad. If you could start and finish, not the whole Shema, but if you could start and finish even one perek, just the first chapter, or even one pasuk, you could just say Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad Baruch Shem, done. You should do it. So the Gemara says, fine, that's a checkmate. In other words, our Mishnah says, if they could start and finish, I assume it means start and finish the whole thing. But you have a clear Braita, which is also a Tanai, right? By the way, you know what Braita is? To just make this a little bit more clear, Rambam explains this in his Pirusha Mishnayot, Haktamatu the Pirusha Mishnayot. It says Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had a yeshiva, had a massive yeshiva. Rabbi was a billionaire. He was one of the richest individuals in the entire generation. He was comparable with Antoninus, who was the emperor of the Rome, and they were best friends. And Antoninus would give him truckloads of money every single week. Right? He liked him so much. He says, "You're Jewish. After I'm gone, after I die, you need money to bribe the next emperors and for next generations." So here it is. He had a whole system of giving him gold in a way that no other Roman official would actually understand. That's a fascinating story in Masechet Avodah Zarah. At some point we'll do it. Amud Yomi. But nevertheless, Rabbi was very rich, and he got all of the Chachamim together, and he basically instituted the writing of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, even though that otherwise would have been asur, but he did it in order that we should have it and it should not be forgotten. Now, he was not the only person that did it. Like any idea that you have, it's a good idea and it's time for it. And several different people try to do it, and the best one gets established. So he wrote a sefer. Rabbi wrote his sefer, and he called it Mishnah. It's the name of a sefer. That's what it is. And his best student was Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia also wrote his sefer and called it, guess what? Called it Braita. Which one caught on? Which one was more comprehensive and good and concise in the language and all-encompassive? Was Mishnah. And therefore Mishnah basically caught on and became completed afterwards and became the main body of what the Gemara is basically written on. But Braitot are as the next level of importance. Is considered also Tanaic work, and they're serious. So if you have a Braita that seems to clearly describe what a Mishnah means, which Mishnah was not described clearly, what do? Nothing. You throw your hands. You say, fine, that's what it means. We thought it may mean the whole Shema, because it says start and finish. It doesn't say start and finish what. But there's a Braita that he found that clearly says if you can start and finish even one perek or even one pasuk, you're good to go. So it's fine. Very, very good. That's the explanation. End of the story. Says the Gemara. Hachinami Kamar. Gemara says, fine, I agree. That's what he means. Im yecholin lahatchil. That's what the Mishnah means as well. Im yecholin lahatchil veligmor afilu perek echad or afilu pasuk achad. That's exactly the meaning of our Mishnah as well. Until you don't get to the Shura, Yatchilu, they should start Ve'im Lav, Lo Yatchilu. And if you can't start and finish a pasuk even, then you should not even start. Top of Yutet Amud Bet. Ha'omdim b'Shura, now we mentioned the people who are standing in the Shura, the inner ones should not say it, the outer ones should say it. So, says the Gemara, what does inner one mean? What does outer one mean? What does that exactly mean? Says the Gemara, Tam Rabbana. We learned in the Braita. Shura haro'eh penima, patura. V'she'ena ro'eh penima, chayevet. The shura that sees the inside, they are chayav. If I could do this easily, would be that let's imagine the avelim are sitting here inside the circle, and then there are circles of people around them standing basically in line in order to be getting inside and comforting the family. So the shura, this one, that sees the inner circle. Imagine this is not people. This is just I did it in order for it to become more clear. The avadim are sitting inside, and people are standing around them trying to comfort them. So this is the first shura, and this is the second one. So it says the Gemara, the second one, who sees the inner circle, they are considered the penimim and they're patur. Anything after this point, they're chayav. Now the Bach asks, it says, why in the world you don't say that the inner one means this one? Why don't we say this one should be patur and this already should be hayav? The inner one. If I would ask all of you, the inner one, you would all say inner one is this one. So why do you say this one? Right? Imagine the language of the Gemara is shura haro'eh pnima patur, v'she'ena ro'eh pnima chayav. Just say the inner circle. And Bach answers because the language of the Gemara is the penimiim. Penimiim are chayav, are patur rather, and the chitzoniim are chayav. Penimiim is plural form. Right? So the two inner ones. And the logic he gives is, if people are standing here, right? This is one person, there's another person, there's another person. The back, the people in the back, in between the shoulders, they still could see the avelim directly. The third line and up already, you can't really even see them. So the immediate, basically, surrounding is considered the first two rows. That's what it means, right? That's still very much immediate. The avelim see you see them. It's not proper, it's not respectful that you're doing your own thing when you're mamash standing right there. Wait for have some respect, wait for them to go, to comfort the grief, and then you go out and you say your Shema. But if you're outer than this already, and you're waiting to get in, then you're chayav. Says the one. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Habayim Machmad Ha'avel, Peturim, Machmad Atzman, Chayavim. Rabbi Yehuda says it depends why you're there. If you are, this is Machloket Rishonim, is a debate within the commentaries what exactly this means, but the way Rashi understands it is people who are there for the funeral, that means they are close friends of the family, they're there because they want to be a part of the funeral, they are patur. But people who just came as tag-alongs, they didn't really care about it. They came either because they wanted to just, out of curiosity, see what's happening, or they came because of peer pressure. So they came. They are chayav. Other Rishonim learned that the immediate family, they are the ones who are considered machamat ha'evel. That means they are connected to the family so much so that their immediate family, they are patur, and the rest of people are chayav. So that's the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav. Now, from here on, Rabotai, we're not going to start this even. From here on, Daf Yutet Amud Bet Daf Chaf. These are going to be some of the most amazing pages of Masechet Berachot as it comes to Shas concepts. In other words, now we're going to, for a moment, take a break from Shema and go to completely unrelated things, but they are so important they become kind of like Shas-wide concepts. We can start with a concept right now of you do the right thing even though that's going to be embarrassing, right? If something wrong is happening, do you concern yourself with the kavod of people, right? The example of the Gemara is, if you notice you're walking in the street and you notice the only gown that you're wearing, the only clothing that you're wearing is shatnez, is made out of seber and pishtim. The Torah says you cannot wear such a thing, right? Do you have to take it off and walk half naked home? In the middle of marketplace, you're in Times Square, and you realize that you have shatnez. In New York, there was a fellow, one of the shatnez 60 years ago. It was something that people were not mindful of. Baruch Hashem, nowadays, almost no frum Jew buys a suit without first making sure one way or another that this does not contain shatnez. But back in the day, so there was this fellow that he was a guru of shatnez. He had such a good eye and he was so trained. When he would be walking next to you, he could take a look at your suit and tell you it's shatnez or not. Nowadays, people do it with labs and with microscope and whatnot. And he was very good. So imagine if the guy walks up to you and tells you what you're wearing is shatnez. You have to take it off? Or can you say, well, it's very embarrassing for me to take this off and have, in middle, I'm a CEO of a company and I'm going to be walking, you know what people are going to do with Snapchat and Facebook Live and Dead and all those things. Hashem Yirahem, right? Is he mechuyav to do it? Is he not mechuyav to do it? If you are that third person, that expert, do you have to tell him that he's wearing a shatnez? Or should you just zip your mouth and not say anything until he gets home? Does it make a difference if it's a shatnez that's the Torah level or a rabbinic level? All of those are fascinating things we're going to Bezat Hashem discuss in the days to come.